All right, if I can ask everybody to start moving back towards their chairs. As soon as the CEPAC chair is back, we'll start again. Everybody's back. Good job. Okay, we're going to launch back into this. So we have about an hour and 10 minutes to kind of turn, in a sense, to the future and say what now or what next, based on lessons learned, obviously. And actually, I'm hopeful that Mary and David will be back very shortly. But let me introduce first the other two members of the Policy Roundtable. Actually, I'll let you guys introduce yourself. I know the organizations you're with, but you'll do a better job at this point of telling people what role you play there. Jane?
Sure. So my name is Jane Horvath, and I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the National Academy for State Health Policy. And my role there is to run the Center for Prescription Drug Pricing Policy. And we work with states to help them craft effective cost containment, cost constrainment policies around prescription drug spending and costs.
Thanks. Welcome. And Eric.
Hi, Eric Schindler, clinical pharmacist with United Healthcare. I work for United Healthcare, and I'm part of the clinical team that reviews drugs such as these for formulary positioning, clinical program development, and pharmacoeconomic analysis.
So Eric, well, we are waiting for Mary and David. Maybe you could just tell people what actually happens, in your offices, in your rooms, when a new drug like Symdeko comes out. What happens? What kind of flexibilities do you have? What constraints do you have? What's the process? Who looks at the data? Who do you talk to? What happens?
Well, I have a multidisciplinary team that looks at this, but I think also want to preface any of the statements as, being a part of the policy roundtable as part of the payer, want to make sure any comments that I have following gives the proper amount of deference to the condition and to the patients that have spoken up today. And I thank Jeremy and thank Chad and Sari for their comments. And so we review all of that. And this particular class of drug has been a class of drugs that haven't been significantly managed, probably rightfully so, up until this point. This is a class of agents that, when looking at United Healthcare's data, 3 out of every 10,000 scripts is for a CFTR modulator. However, those 3 scripts account for 1% of our total cost. And so when we look at trying to look at the sustainability or evaluate the sustainability of that system, it's something that we have concerns about and want to make sure and see what can be done. And institutions like yourself is helping us try to get a better finger on that pulse. But again, up until this point, this has not been a condition that we have restricted or managed very tightly.
So, by the way, I noticed you said, and you noticed, I'm sure you said up until this point, so I'll push you on that in a second.
I would follow it up as that I don't think that after this point would be a condition that we would restrict. I think that a commercial payer hasn't been in a situation where we've put kids in the middle of a tug of war, or I think stiff-armed was another phrase used earlier. So, I think that's how we've gone about it and how we'll continue to do so.
Okay. So for a payer, and I'm obviously asking you to generalize, a new drug comes out, you get a team to look at the evidence, you look at the FDA label, you create an insurance policy. So in this case, do you just copy the FDA label and just put it in the books? What happens?
The FDA review is included. We'll also, our current criteria is that we do emphasize the use of Center of Excellence or Cystic Fibrosis care centers. We try to evaluate are there aspects of a program that would potentially not add value but only add barriers? And when that's the case, we definitely would remove those. And so it's just making sure that the care is available and it's the most efficient aspect of care. So, we will ask the clinician or the specialist to attest that this, in their opinion, is working. And if it is, we'll see you in 2 years. So that's kind of.
So you put a little flag to say every 2 years they've got to come back and say it's still working.
Currently,
they don't have to show test results; they just attest.
Yeah,
to
we found that adding medical records submission to document an FEV1 only adds barriers and doesn't improve any outcomes.
Okay. Mary, do patients that you hear from, families, what's their experience, and I know I'm asking you to generalize, with the insurance world?
Well, I just made a note that you do not ask for detailed documentation, and my quip was if only every payer did that. Unfortunately, we do know that a significant portion of our community experiences barriers to care. We know first and foremost that impacts our community, our people with cystic fibrosis, their family members, and that those barriers are resulting in delaying care or skipping it altogether, which I alluded to earlier in the day. We also know that it places a pretty significant burden on our care teams. As you alluded, cystic fibrosis care is delivered in a nationwide network of basically specialty care centers, centers of excellence across the country. And a survey we did several years ago of those care teams showed that over half of their time was spent on prior authorizations, appeals, denials for care. And that certainly takes away from the complexity, delivering the complex care that's provided. So I can go on and on. I brought some examples of criteria for these drugs in particular that have been put in place by payers across the country, both public and private. They do not always line up to the FDA label. They do not coincide with guidelines on standard of care, best practice. So I think there is risk there for sure in our patients, and we see it in real time.
So are most of the, let me just drill down a little bit here because this is interesting, I think, for everybody to understand. Are the barriers, like the prior auth and other barriers, are those around ancillary care, or is it the CFTR modulators themselves?
For every part of cystic fibrosis care, but yes, including the CFTR modulators. A typical one, a pretty standard practice that we see in payer criteria for the modulators looks something like excluding those that were not included in the clinical trials. So excluding those who have FEV1 above 90, below 40, excluding those who cultured for bacteria that were excluded from the trials. Or we also see requirements of fail first for non-modulators. So we have definitely seen criteria where you have to fail for pulmozyme, which, as Jeremy said, it's not a modulator. It's something that helps break up the mucus in the lungs. So you'd have to fail on that before you could try a modulator.
So let me ask the clinical experts. Somebody gave that idea to a payer or many. Is there a clinical instinct behind that at all? Is it that you want to maximize best supportive care before starting a modulator? Is there something there that's valid, or does it sound completely fishy to you? That kind of idea. Pulmozyme, fail it before you can get a CFTR modulator. We'll talk about patients who didn't fit the study criteria because that's kind of a separate issue, I think.
Well, I think we worry that we're going to make you jump through these hoops before we approve this expensive drug. I don't know that, I've never asked, why do you make us do that?
It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, you're modulating CFTR with these drugs. These are the drugs that we've used historically are to treat the complications from having impaired CFTR function. So to me, it makes sense to use these drugs regardless of what they're on, because whatever you do will impact the natural history of the disease.
And actually, to add to that, and something Mary said a while back, that a lot of the treatments, and you mentioned Pulmozyme just now.
Oh, she did.
That's a nebulized treatment. It takes 20 minutes or more to inhale that. And if you're somehow not able to fit that into a busy day, to say that therefore you couldn't take a pill doesn't compute.
So it sounds like, I mean, an insurer might want to make sure that the overall care was provided to a high standard. And so I can understand maybe they would restrict care to centers of excellence, so they have a network, I guess, of places where you can get this care. But within that setting, at least, I just have a hard time understanding, because it is an administrative barrier that they have to spend their own time on to administer. If they're ultimately going to say yes to a kid for a CFTR modulator, I don't understand the rationale or even the self-interest that's being served by putting in a fail first with Pulmozyme or something like that. And maybe I'm overly focusing on that one, but Mary, you look like you have lots more you could say on that.
I don't understand it either, and I don't think it should happen.
I don't know if you guys talked about this, but one of the other hoops that we have to jump through, and this is largely our nurses and social workers that have to do it, for getting approval, getting pre-authorization. For some, and I don't know which the providers are, but which the insurers are, but for some of them we have to send a genotype. That makes sense, that the patient meets the FDA requirements. But to have to send it every 6 months, it's been a long time since
CEPAC, would you like to take a shadow vote on a policy recommendation that a genetic test needs to be redone every 6 months?
My favorite is that we had one that was I think it was quarterly. The physician had to confirm that the patient did still have cystic fibrosis.
Hey, there are miraculous cures, right? I guess. Well, I'm sorry to hear for those struggles. And it is something that we hope to highlight in our policy recommendations and reports, where there are lots of different misalignments. We'll talk about several of them, perhaps. But a misalignment between common sense and insurance coverage is one we should all really work against. So let me turn briefly to let me stick with you for a second, Eric. So not managing it, it comes in. Do you ever pick up the phone and call the manufacturer, I'll just say Vertex now since there is one, and say, we'd really love a lower price. Can't you cut us a break? We're a big company. We're supposed to negotiate, keep health premiums in line. Help us out here.
Well, we're a big company. We're not as big as France. We're not as big as Canada. We're not as big as United Kingdom. And we know how those negotiations have gone. So I think we understand that it is currently a monopoly. And yeah, we would love for the price to be lower. But we're not there.
So why don't they charge you twice as much, $500,000?
It's a good question.
$600,000.
That's the concern. And one of the things that I wrote down here as I was listening was, I followed this organization probably since the original Hep C report, and have followed all that. And I think that's an interesting example. Is that, and apology if I go a little long, but the problem or the issue with Hep C when Sovaldi came out was that Sovaldi was a great drug, and it was compared to a protease inhibitor combined with a interferon-based agent, and those drugs were very expensive, but it was controlled because the treatment was worse than the disease. Right. And then they came out with a drug that was better, and theoretically they even charged less than what the whole conglomerate of a one-year treatment. So what would that company do? And if I remember correctly, in Civic was Vertex as well. And then you think about, we talked about Orkambi and Symdeko, and then the next one down the line is, the potential triple therapy through the same company. And is the benefit that we're talking with these drugs, and quote unquote what was used in some of the things was the potential benefit that we don't have documented, is an absolute benefit. But then 12, 18 months come down the line, and then there's a triple drug therapy, and it's improved. So have we reset the cost of innovation? And so it was $300,000, and now we have a 15% increase, and so now that's $400,000. So where do we go? Can they double the price? I hope not.
All right. So we're going to come back to pricing. I know I might not get there. I'm kidding. We're getting to price. But let's continue on with a few of the vegetables on the plate before we get to that, to the dessert. I do want to talk about the clinical aspects too. So tell us a little bit more about, again, in thinking a little bit, I guess, from what some of the insurers are doing, is there any feeling that you get that insurers want you to try to keep patients from starting these drugs until they're bad enough or old enough or something else? Is there a pressure against starting it early? Is there a clinical reason? Is there a clinical reason to wait? If a young child seems to be doing okay, do you sense any urgency to start? What's the current landscape look like?
Well, since you're asking young kids...
I'm sorry, can you pull the microphone just
first.
A little closer?
And I think that's changing. I know probably just a couple years ago, I had conversations with a couple of teenagers and their parents, somebody who was doing very well. We had a new drug. We didn't have years of experience with the drug to know that it was safe. It was $300,000, and the patient, the family, and with my support as their clinician decided, let's hold off on this. I wouldn't have that conversation for somebody that I was more worried about clinically, and now with the evidence that wasn't there at first. I think I'm talking about Orkambi here, a combination drug that showed a statistically significant improvement in pulmonary function, but not a very big one compared to what we'd seen with Kalydeco.
Right.
I don't know that I was fully won over, but then as we got more data to show that the improvement continued, and I've said a bunch of times already today, that's compared to what you would have expected, a decline. And very impressively, that there seemed to be protection from exacerbations. It's changed me from a skeptic to a believer. And so if I were still taking care of that teenager, I think I probably would have urged to go, for her to go on it sooner rather than later. Okay. But I don't know that I've felt, and I'll have to talk to our nurses and social workers again, I don't think we've felt pressure from the insurance company, don't put the patient on this.
Okay. Manu, any different experience that you see or hear about?
No, I think in general the experience is similar. I think it is dependent on the medication we're talking about. I mean, I think that for Orkambi, it was more an individualized decision, risk-benefit for a patient. I think when Kalydeco came down the line, my perspective was I think everyone who has the right mutation should go on it just because of the magnitude of the effect.
So
Okay.
in my case studies,
Yeah.
3 of them are 3 out of 8 are examples of denials when lung function was above 90%. So yes, I think there are absolutely payers out there that are taking that path. And Jeremy, I'm sure, has something to say about young children.
Yeah, both of our sons are on Orkambi. We have went through what has become the expected new drug process, which is to be denied the first time and to have to file an appeal. They both were approved, and we have not experienced being denied access to the drugs, but we have experienced in a passive-aggressive kind of way, which comes at the end of the year. I'm a pastor. I work at a church, so therefore we're a fairly small organization, and where our stiff arm comes, I think was the word that was pushed around, is when renewal time comes and they say, oh, we would love to keep you with us. It's going to be a 60% increase in your renewal next year. Which is, it's very hard for me not to go, well, I think I know why that has happened to us, and it's directly correlated to the cost of these drugs. I don't have any evidence of that, but it's pretty hard not to have that. So, in our organization, we're forced to move to a new insurance plan every single year and reset, just to be able to chase an affordable premium. And I know it's directly I assume that it's directly correlated to the cost of these drugs.
I mean, that's something we've heard about before in terms of the smaller the denominator. Hemophilia, we've done a meeting on that, same kinds of issues. It doesn't work very well with a small employer's kind of bottom to sit on those kinds of costs. But it is a shame what it causes as far as the kind of spinning through different insurers. So again, a little bit on the clinical side. I was trying to think what the cost effectiveness would be of sending patients to live in Canada for 10 years versus the life years gained. Actually, one of the more amazing things you could do is to use that leap of faith and say if we flew people up there, they'd live 10 years longer. We don't think that would be the case. But what does it teach us about what we can learn or improve about the standard of care in the U.S.? Is there a need for more? Are there clinical guidelines? Is there a need for more clinical guideline? Is it just our system of patients being poor and having to deal with different insurance structures that makes them as inherent, and that's why they're living less? But this age gap, this longevity gap, seems to predate the CFTRs. So that's why I'm fascinated by it in a way, and I'm sure the field is. And I'd love to have some kind of recommendation in our report that suggests what Americans can do to get that 10 years.
So I think we've been having sidebars as you all bring up the Canadian study, because obviously that was something we jointly did with our partners and collaborators in Canada. And there's some misinformation and perhaps some overcharacterizations that's been happening with that study. And so I want to tell you what we saw in the study, and I want to tell you what's happened since. The study, as has been mentioned, if you excluded the Medicaid population, the survival rate was equivalent.
Okay.
So for private coverage, it was the same in the US and Canada. There were 3 reasons that were speculated when the study was released for the discrepancy. 1, coverage, the notion of more standard coverage universally in Canada. 2, socioeconomic disparities. They're wider here, and all the complications that brings. And 3, nutrition. And I'm sure that David might want to speak to this in a minute. But at the point of time that the study evaluated, there was a much faster uptake on a more aggressive push in nutrition in Canada in the 70s and 80s than there was in the U.S. It sort of that care lagged in the U.S. And as we look at those cuts again more recently, they did a much smaller cut of the study. You see that disparity shrinking. And so more recent cuts of the Canadian and U.S. comparators are much closer together. And there's not the 10-year gap. I'm not going to remember, maybe you guys do, what the gap, I'm looking to Mike. Maybe Mike remembers if it's like 5 years or it's shrinking. So it's not unimportant. But I think we need to be careful not to overweight that particular study.
Wow.
And I think...
Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I may be not totally up to date on this, but I think even if we were going to send our patients to Canada, my dad was born there, and I like Canada, but I think we'd have to be careful which province we sent them to, because I don't think all the provinces had the Vertex drugs, had worked out the deal yet. All right.
Well, I mean, if you just look at the outcomes in states of this country, there are variability in CF outcomes in the state. If you want to do really well, go to Minnesota, right?
Closer to Canada?
What's that? Well, what I'm saying is that there are other factors besides just geography that explain some of these outcomes.
So could we do any good by recommending that American clinicians either focus on nutrition as a specific element of the basic care here that could be standardized more? Or is there any improvement that we could help suggest?
In terms of standardization of care, the U.S. system is world-class and is really looked to as a model, including by a lot of our Canadian counterparts, with a comprehensive effort to utilize registry data to drive quality improvement in care delivery. And there are some wonderful studies, reports, and data sets that really show the discrepancy across care narrowing significantly.
Okay, so it sounds like we're doing
I also want to point out there are guidelines that have been sponsored by the foundation convening experts on all aspects of care, whether it's nutrition, pulmonary management of chronic therapies, exacerbation, I mean, everything they can think of, mental health, CFRD, bone health. So these are available to every CF caregiver in the country. So that data does exist.
Okay, all right, that's great. Okay, should we talk about pricing as well as coverage in a way? You know, this is one of those meetings where the votes were very similar, 10 to 1 or unanimous, or 11 to 1 or unanimous, that the evidence was adequate to say that these drugs are better than best supportive care. And as I stated at the very outset, I'm not hearing, and it's really interesting to get the important anecdotes about where insurance is being a major problem, but it doesn't feel like there's a move afoot to manage this as an area like psoriasis or something where there could be step therapy or any kinds of major restrictions of any kind on coverage. The value has been an issue in the pricing, as we've heard from some patient testimony and from some of the other conversations. So I know we don't, unfortunately, have a representative from Vertex. As you know, they were invited, and they chose to withdraw late in the process. So I'm going to try a relatively risky maneuver and treat this chair as if they were here, and try not to be too unfair with that, because I don't want to pitch a Vertex question to Mary, for instance, right, Mary? You can take them, but I think it's important for us to at least wrestle with what they might say, and I'm going to try to use statements that they have said in the press before and other people's statements to kind of frame a broader discussion with everybody. So, in a conference call after the FDA approval of Orkambi, Vertex's Chief Commercial Officer, Stuart Arbuckle, cited 4 factors justifying Orkambi's price: a small patient population, the clinical benefit of a drug combination that treats the underlying cause of the disease, the time and cost of Vertex's efforts to bring the medicine to market, and the need to invest in research to develop other therapies for tens of thousands of patients with other forms of cystic fibrosis. So that may not be comprehensive, but it was at the time their formal statement. And some of those we've talked about today. We haven't talked as much about the small patient population. That has come up, and it's why we treated this under our ultra-rare disorder, because the genetic subtype is rare. The reason, though, that I think people know this, that historically that was considered to be important from a pricing perspective, was the sense that there wouldn't be any ROI, basically, on a very small population, 10, 100, 1,000 patients, unless you charge prices that were far beyond standard cost effectiveness. I think we all know that Vertex is making over $1 billion a year on Orkambi alone, and so at least at that kind of multiplication factor, it's not as much of a concern. The clinical benefit of a drug combination, I think we've tried to grasp that, right? How much better is Orkambi? We've tried to look at the numbers. We've tried to think of it as comprehensively as possible. The time and cost of Vertex efforts to bring the medicine to market. To bring Vertex to market? No. Vertex's efforts to bring Orkambi to market. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the history of how the foundation worked with Vertex and basically encouraged it, and kind of just the historical, how many years and what happened with the money at that point?
Sure. So almost no FDA-approved therapy for cystic fibrosis alone came to market without the involvement of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. The Vertex model is similar to many others in that case. So we provided very early stage funding for what was at the time Aurora Biosciences, which has subsequently got purchased by Vertex throughout this process. And Aurora Biosciences had at that point just a technology platform to screen compounds against, in this case, the CFTR gene, and see if it had a hit. And we were very intrigued by that, and they could do it faster than anything else we did. And so we began by giving them, I think it was a $5 million tranche of funding to do this in cystic fibrosis, something that had not been on their radar. That began the relationship. Aurora subsequently got purchased by Vertex, and the collaboration continued all the way through. We continue to work with Vertex because we do not, along with many, many other companies, we actually worked with over 100 companies last year to try to bring forward as many therapies as possible, both to treat the symptoms of cystic fibrosis as well as bring about additional modulators, and as well as look forward to a one-time cure. That's our mission. So in addition to funding throughout the process, particularly at the early stage and the de-risking stage of bringing them into this rare disease where there wasn't a lot of incentive to develop something, even though the science was extremely promising. We also, again, with Vertex and any other company that we work with, bring a host of other resources. So some of those include the patient registry. The data is extremely valuable. The network of clinical care centers, which also house our clinical research, our therapeutics development network, where you can have the patients right there ready to start the trials. We fund, in fact, Mike, my colleague in the back, leads this work, fund training to enable those trials to get on board quickly. We have over 60 specialists in clinical trial development and consultation to develop the endpoints of studies and work collaboratively with communities. So the point of the story, I could keep going, but the point of the story is our job is to make this go faster and to first bring people into cystic fibrosis who might not be considering it as an indication for their technologies or their compounds, and then help it go further faster. And that's all done using funds that the community itself raises through walks. It's actually, I think it's St. Louis's Great Strides Walk this weekend, and dinner dances and wine openers, and thousands and thousands of community members, which you heard about from the testimony this morning, collaborating to find a cure.
So it sounds like, if I could paraphrase, they wouldn't have done this, couldn't have done this without you.
I think that's safe to say that I mean, Aurora would not have been in cystic fibrosis without the CF Foundation. No.
Yeah.
Can I add a thing or two to
Sure.
what Mary has said?
Sure.
Has said so eloquently and accurately. When I've had conversations with Jeff Lydon, prompted by letters that a couple of us wrote saying we love these new drugs and the promise that they show, but the price seems kind of high. And we had a couple of meetings, and he gave the same reasons as those four that you listed. But one of the things that, I mean, it seemed to us that the main reason was the market would bear what they were charging. And the thing about the science that was needed to go into the development, yes, Vertex has provided some of the money for that science. But as Mary pointed out, some of the early studies were funded by the CF Foundation. A lot of the early studies that delineated the molecular and protein defects, that was done with money from everybody here in this room through the NIH. And none of that science would have happened if we were waiting for Vertex to pop up and say, oh, we want some bright scientists to figure out CF for us. So public funds, CF Foundation funds made the science possible, and then the foundation funding what was Aurora Biosciences that becomes Vertex. That's very important. The other thing that Jeff Lydon has said to us, and his other executives had said in meetings, that if we charged less, and by the way, people have asked us, what do you think or we volunteered. If you ask me what the ideal price would be, see, I don't know. It probably costs $1 to make one of those pills. I don't think it would be fair to charge $1 for it. But losing the, when we met, oh yeah, I know. It said if you wanted us to charge a whole lot less, what you're asking for is for us to go out of business, for us to get swallowed up by a bigger fish who's not going to care about a disease that has only 30,000 patients in the United States. They want to deal with those other big drug companies want to deal with patients, populations that are in the millions, so they can make a lot of money. So you don't want us to fail, and we said, yeah, we don't want you to fail. And he'd say, if you're asking us to drastically reduce our price, that means we're going to be at risk of either going bankrupt or getting swallowed up by another company that's not going to care about CF.
Well, again, I wish we had someone here in that chair who could respond to that. I'll circle back to that to a certain extent, but I wanted to follow on with Mary just a little bit. So I know that there's some commentary that the CF Foundation, as you said, de-risked. You took the riskiest part. You helped them through that. So the company had help. And yet you talked about, and I think the term that you used that's going to get used the rest of the day is stiff-armed. Is there a best practice, a lesson learned from that? If patient organizations are going to get involved at the kind of R&D level with their disease, is there a way that you could have imagined a different relationship or a different understanding about pricing and cost that could have come out of that? Anything that could have avoided your feeling stiff-armed at the end of the day?
I don't know if I want to keep with feeling stiff-armed. Our mission is to find a cure. Our mission is to continue. These drugs only work for a portion of our population, and I think, Eric, you were sort of alluding to this. We still have almost half of our patients who are waiting for their drug, and you heard Chad talk so eloquently about what it's like to wait and see the promise but not have it there. So that's our mission, is to drive that forward.
But how could you imagine a role for the patient group?
The prices are set in a negotiation between the manufacturer and the payer, and we do not have a role in that, and nor have we been offered one.
Okay. Well, I find it really interesting to think, given the power that you exercised, you are looked to as a case example of how to do it right in many ways. And your own sense of coming out of it without any power at all around the pricing, I think is interesting to think about whether...
we still have a long way to go.
There's something else
and
there.
A lot of folks that we need to convince to come to the table with us.
Yeah. So let me then talk about the price too. And again, let me actually bring Jane in. Jane, you've been up here patiently waiting. So in terms of the price, and David, you said you were asked at one point, what's the right price if you think it's too high? And I have a fistful of published op-eds from other clinician researchers in the field like yourself who've been complaining about the price for many years. None of them say what the price should be. So as I think many people know, ICER's report, you can use the cost effectiveness and turn it on its head and say at what price range would it represent what we call value-based price benchmark. Interestingly, other countries do that too at a national level, not always officially, sometimes behind kind of closed doors, but Vertex has been negotiating with them. So, and I think you mentioned it, there's been a long history of tension and conflict between European countries and Vertex over the prices, especially of Orkambi. France is in a very difficult place with them right now. I think, here's a French patient. Patients and families are being used as a trade in negotiations between the company and health authorities. From a patient perspective, it's not right to use the most vulnerable party in the whole discussion as a pawn. This came out after the company pulled its new trials on the combination therapies from France in reaction to France's request for an 80% discount off the list price of Orkambi. Ireland, on the other hand, spent 2 years in negotiation, and quite difficult ones, again, because there were prominent cases of kids who died during those 2 years waiting for treatment, and the public was upset. The nation didn't want to give in, if you will, to a higher price. They came to an agreement, and it was announced in the Irish Times, and it's $72,000 a year, U.S., for every cystic fibrosis patient in the country. And that was a 10-year agreement. So they negotiate ex-U.S., at least in some cases. We know that even the ones like in England where they've still said no, Orkambi, the asking price for Orkambi is £104,000, which is about $150,000 maybe, dollars U.S. at best, and that's too much for them. So, Jane, what do the states, the U.S. states, feel like? Are they involved in this broader issue of what's a fair price? And I will invite you to talk about New York because you know about it as much as we do. Mm-hmm. But what's your perspective from the states and the way that they're thinking about the price and the value of these drugs?
So I think the issue for the states is affordability. So something can be very high value, but it is still not affordable for everybody who is indicated by the FDA label. So there's value and affordability, and they're thinking about the mix of those things. And, you know, states as payers, in working with some states and just doing some very brief analytics in the states that specifically I've been working very actively in, when you get right down to it, the state has a stake in the drug coverage of anywhere from 25 to 30% of the population of the state, which is a lot of state dollars involved. And that's not even like the tax expenditures, when you don't, the tax relief you get at the state level for your employer premiums and your personal premiums, just it mimics the feds. So those are lost revenue dollars on top of the direct spend of 25 to 30%. You know, and these things, they're heartbreaking issues. I'm sure you remember in Arkansas, right, when Arkansas Medicaid would not cover Kalydeco and, you know, made that young woman wear the vest. You know, that was ridiculous. On one level, it was absolutely ridiculous, but on another level, it came out at the end of the budget year, and states operate under constitutional balanced budget requirements. You know, it's against the law to end the year with a deficit. And so this was just a miserable reality all the way around. And, you know, the state was sued. You know, they knew they didn't have a leg to stand on, and they had to capitulate. You know, so the outcome was proper, but at the end of the day, the situation wasn't solved. And, you know, the situation with CF is just horrible, I think, you know, in terms of the pressure between price and access. And I think just for purposes of thinking at a larger level that payers, states, and commercial payers have to think about. So there's 30,000 people with CF, right? And we're talking about a treatment that costs $300,000 a year. You know, and it's a good treatment, and everybody needs this treatment. But, you know, we have 3,000 kids a year diagnosed with childhood leukemia, and the newest treatment for that is $725,000. And then you have spinal muscular dystrophy. There's 10 million people, and the newest treatment that's a really important treatment is $750,000 for the first year, $350,000 then for the life of the patient annually. Multiple sclerosis, 400,000 people in the United States, $83,000 a year. And so every one of these drugs has merit and is incredibly important to people. But kids need education, we need clean air, we need bridges, we need transportation. And the business model of the industry is broken, in my view. And I spent 10 years in the industry at Merck, and I value the industry and I respect the industry, but, you know, their business model is broken. And so, I mean, that's where states are trying to think about exerting pressure on the business model. And that's where they should be thinking about, you know, the business model of the industry.
So can you tell them about the new law in New York and whether other states are watching that?
Yeah, other states are definitely watching it, and I think New York is at a pretty critical point, given the results of the vote of their board. So New York has, the only in the nation, they have a budget cap on their Medicaid pharmacy benefit. And so the budget cap is set by law. It's CPI plus 3, I think. And then for budget purposes, the legislature said, and you need to get another $88,000 out of the per year after that. So what they do is they watch quarterly, you know, the tracking of the growth in the RX budget, and to the extent in a quarter that they expect to breach the budget cap, then they turn around and they look at, in the Medicaid drug benefit, what products are potentially driving that spending growth, you know, over the quarter and taking them over the cliff. And then they'll identify them, and I think in this last round they identified like 73 drugs that might be potentially in this mix. And then after further sorting and stuff like that, they wound up with 30. They divide by brands and generics, and they really tend to focus on the brands. And then they call in the manufacturers and ask them for rebates, in addition to any rebates they may have already negotiated at the start of the year. And to the extent that a manufacturer is willing to provide extra rebates to the Medicaid program, which lowers their net cost for each prescription dispensed, then that's good. But if you're not willing to negotiate that, then they send the product, they recommend it to the Drug Utilization Review Board. And every state has a DURB. They were set up under the Medicaid Rebate Law of 1990. And so they've sort of repurposed their DURB to this value estimation. And then the DURB wisely contracted with ICER.
Didn't contract.
Oh, okay.
Contract.
All right. But they requested the assistance of ICER. And so Vertex has been the first company to go through this process. And then the DURB board voted unanimously, as I recall, to support the ICER analysis and recommend that Medicaid now go back and get from Vertex rebates in the range of the value analysis that ICER produced. And to my knowledge, Vertex is still thinking about it. But the tools at Medicaid's disposal at that point are to pull the drug off of the Medicaid managed care formularies. And in New York, most of Medicaid is now in privatized managed care. So that's a significant step. Pulling it back, making it available through fee-for-service only, and applying patient restrictions, hurdles, in the hopes that because it's New York, Vertex will find that personally to be very painful and come back to the table. I mean, they're trying to use some market leverage here. And so nobody's done anything. Like, New York hasn't done anything with the tools that they have, and Vertex hasn't done anything either. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes.
I just want to leave one question open about something about what you said, because
Sure.
we tried to learn a lot about their process once they contacted us. And at least to my knowledge, there is not in the law or on the table there any idea of restricting access. And they actually made that clear at the meeting as well. The negative penalties they have include disclosure requirements and a penalty associated with other drugs related to prior auth, but it's not like whether you can get it or not.
That's not the documents that I see, so.
Well, we can, all right. Well, okay. They looked at that, and at least at their own public meeting, that's what they said from the podium.
Okay.
So, but just I think one of the bottom lines, though, and I was coming back to our Vertex representative at the end, was this isn't just an ex-US issue. This is coming home to the States in a new way, trying again to get some sense of how to align the price. And they are concerned about affordability, but at the end of the day, they're trying to figure out how to get that just without kind of wildly, kind of chopping at expensive drugs. They're trying to figure out where the price doesn't line up.
And some states are, one state just did, and it's on the table, and 10 others to import from Canada for very expensive drugs.
Yeah, they're trying that.
And other states are talking about setting up rate-setting commissions, all-payer rate setting.
So my guess is if someone from Vertex were here, they would want to come back to one of or two of the four things that they talked about again, which was the time and cost of the effort to bring it to market and the need to invest in research for the future. And if I were going to be provocative, I would read a quote from that well-known anti-pharma talking head, Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar, who this week said, "For too long, there's been a lot of talk on drug prices and no action. Drug companies have insisted we can have new cures or affordable prices, but not both. I've been a drug company executive. I know the tired talking points. The idea that if one penny disappears from pharma profit margins, American innovation will all grind to a halt. I'm not interested in hearing those talking points anymore, and neither is the president." So where do you think? No one's here from Vertex, and I wouldn't have asked that question probably if someone were here, but we are at a point where we're all as a country trying to wrestle with this issue. And the business model of a company having this much of a monopoly over the pricing. They talk about, in some ways, one of their critiques of our model was that we did not factor in future price drops on the drugs, but in their analyst report, their CEO was touting how they were immune from price drops because they were going to keep adding new IP to their combinations and that they did not see any kind of price drops through the 2030s. So it feels like we're caught in a bind of wanting to invest in that future innovation, knowing that there are patients out there who don't have a good treatment yet, a lot of patients with CF, and yet both problems of affordability and a sense of a lack of kind of alignment and control between the pricing and what people are getting.
And I would just add that from the patient perspective,
Yeah.
and that I think we sit there very squarely. We do not have the answer for cystic fibrosis yet. We don't even have modulators for half of the population.
Right.
But we know that accessibility and affordability is today a grave threat for a significant portion of our community. Those two things fly in each other's face. So I want to be clear when you asked me about where we sit with industry. Where we do sit also is to explain the struggle that our community faces on accessing and affording their drugs, and that's a real thing for a significant portion of our community.
And Steve,
Yes,
something
please.
that maybe is irrelevant now, but when we had our first conversations with Jeff Lydon and
Yeah,
his executives, the other thing he mentioned that I didn't mention, you said they were making $1 billion a year on Orkambi. Well, he pointed out to us at the time that we first met with them that they had not made a profit any year that they had existed, and that their investors want to see something, and they certainly don't want them to back off on their price when they're not making a profit. Now, that's a couple years have gone by, and that's a different story, but that's part of the background.
And again, that landscape is hard to characterize at any one point in time because Amazon obviously, I think it's just started to make profits, but no one probably thinks Amazon is having a rough time. And Vertex's stock doubled last year, and they've had a huge stock buyback, as we heard from the public comment. So there are countervailing, and the question is, though, you're right. I mean, every company needs new investment and new resources to keep going. The question is, how do we create a sense of balance and sustainability around that? Because as Jane, as you said, and as we know from our meetings, there are real needs in other patient communities for new drugs too. There are real advances, real exciting developments. So it can be very challenging. Eric, I was going to invite you in also at this point if you had any reflections from the private insurer side.
Yeah, I would say when you're talking about the discussion on development, and I remember Mike's passion speech of Kalydeco brought Orkambi brought Symdeko, and there's a fault in that argument in the fact that Kalydeco was 5% of the population, and then Orkambi is 46% of the population. I'm a pharmacist, not an economist, but so at similar price points, you now ninefold increased your population. You could get away with charging 20% of the cost and have double the amount of dollars to invest. But that was, they didn't do that, obviously. And so that's, I think, a fault in that argument of all of this is going into reinvestment, obviously. And you talked about the stock buyback and that. And another comment that you had of, what if they double the price tomorrow? What could we do? The example is, there's a recent example of, in the news here recently was a product in Imbruvica. Similar, relative monopoly in the market. Now it has a little bit of combination, but the oncologists in the space, it's indicated at a dose of 420 milligrams. It comes in a capsule or tablet of 140. They found that majority of patients don't need that amount, the full dose, and they can get by on 140 or 2, and so they get the same effect at 33% of the dose, 66% of the dose. The manufacturer essentially identified that instead of doing that in that formulation, they did everything in a 420 milligram single tablet or a 280 milligram single tablet, 140 milligram single tablet at flat pricing. So essentially tripled their investment, and the oncology community raised up. And as of, I think, yesterday,
They backed off.
Yeah. And so there's ways to fight without restricting access.
Yeah. It's an interesting example. If you haven't read that, it's worth reading. I was going to ask the clinical experts, too. I totally understand, having been a clinician for many years, how distant this can in some ways be from your day-to-day life. But do you think the profession is engaged as much as they should be on the price issues, not engaged enough, too engaged, or engaged in the wrong way? What's the role of the specialty societies? We have seen very organized action, especially in oncology, on several notable occasions to deal with what they view as unfair pricing. What's your view of where your specialty societies and clinicians should be?
Well, I would say I think we're definitely aware of the prices. I mean, I think there's people like David and Brian who've really risen up and made their voices heard more. I feel like as a community we probably could do more overall than what we've done up to this point. But as you alluded to, our primary focus is on a day-to-day and providing access to our patients. But as a community, we probably could do more.
And it's impossible to ignore the siren call of high prices mean the research that we can do for tomorrow's cures for your patients. That's a powerful story. It is. It must be.
Clearly, it is. I mean, we've talked about how this is an advance, but it's certainly not a cure.
Right.
So there is still a crying need to move the science forward to cure the disease, and we're still a long ways from there.
Right.
Yeah, I think we should be raising our voices more, too. But one thing, it's been pointed out, one way among many, that an important way that we differ from the oncology world, where there have been examples where the oncologists have been able to say, no, we're not going to have our hospital stock this new drug that gives 3 more weeks of survival at double the price. And the drug company with the new drug says, okay, we're going to lower the price in half. And that is, we don't yet at least have competition.
Right. Yep.
And we definitely don't want Vertex to stop making their drugs.
No, we don't. Nobody wants that. I'm going to invite the CEPAC to start to think if they have any questions or comments. But Jeremy, I'm going to come back to you. I spent a fair amount of time now talking about dollars, hundreds of thousands, budgets. Does it start to feel like we're losing grip again with the impact on real people and children? How's it feel? Can you keep these in your head, or does it feel like we're off the rails and somehow this is now no longer?
No, I want to be as generous as possible with the process because it's the only way to do the process. I appreciate the sensitivity to the human element of it, but whether it costs $100,000 or $350,000, my family can't afford it unless the healthcare system supports us. Selfishly, I wish I could wave a magic wand and make Vertex make twice as much money because in my mind, it's a honeypot for other pharmaceutical companies to see that there's a future in cystic fibrosis research that might bring a cure and competition to my family. Frankly, I feel like we're having an important conversation too early in the process. Yes, we are in a unique window in the cystic fibrosis community in which the first company has raised up revolutionary drugs that for the 10 years that we've been involved because of my children, we've dreamed about this moment. And I understand that taking a snapshot right here seems like we're headed in a direction that's really difficult. But what I'm dreaming of is what's coming 5 or 10 years down the road, which is a one-time cure that will render the conversation of recurring revenue for Vertex Pharmaceutical completely moot. Because they will not have recurring revenue because this disease will be gone. So, I appreciate the conversation. I think it's important to talk about costs, but my family has dreamed about the day we can argue about how much a pharmaceutical company is making on a drug that's saving my children's life.
Fair enough. Anyone on the CEPAC? Yes, Stacy.
So this is about, I don't know exactly which of you might be the best to answer this one, but it's about the payer mix, both currently and in the future. And one of the reasons I ask is I think it is because the price is so relevant and matters in different ways for different payers currently. So if you're on Medicare, you usually pay a percentage of the price of these drugs when you're filling them. And so I think one of the public comments, it sounded like the person that she was talking about may be on Medicare and completely priced out. And so I'm just curious about, you know, what our current system looks like, but then as we start to see people age, and also, you know, as far as adults go, those who may be qualified for disability, what are you seeing now and what do you envision that looking like?
So coverage for cystic fibrosis is a team sport. That is not mine. I would credit that elsewhere. But what we see in the registry and is reinforced by our additional analyses of cost and access shows that that most of our community has multiple coverage, multiple forms of coverage. So I think it was already said earlier, over half of all children with CF are covered by Medicaid. In some states, that's as high as 90%. Right? For example, Pennsylvania, I think, covers just about every kid with CF. That's a supplemental plan for many of them. About a third of all of our adults are covered by Medicaid. A growing number of our adult community is on Medicare. It's right around 10-12% right now. That's increasing just slightly as they're able to work long enough to have enough eligibility for SSDI rather than a Medicaid. And a good portion of our community, over about 60%, is privately insured. So those numbers don't add to 100, they add to more, which is why I say it's a team sport. There are many, many of our community that has double, triple, or even quadruple insured.
Right. Any other questions or comments from CEPAC? Don?
I'm just curious, maybe from Eric and Jane's standpoint, what your opinion is about this perception versus reality that Mr. Price raised about pricing affecting future innovation in new treatment entity categorizations, so to speak.
So, right. So, you know, if you look at the drug industry over the last 15 years, there's been this sort of mass migration to orphan drugs and oncology. And legislation has spurred some of that, but pricing has also spurred some of that they can charge whatever they want. It's not like your next diabetes pill to control your A1C4. They've all migrated there because it will be what the market can bear and because that you can get extraordinary pricing out of it. And so for Vertex, again, and I don't think you should target, I think what ICER does is changing the conversation, nudging the business model, like you can't attack like one company per se. It's a wholesale thing and change expectations of Wall Street. But what is Vertex going to do? You know, I don't think they're going to make gelato. You know, if the industry expectation of profits declines, there will still be investors. It's still going to be a better investment than Kroger's grocery store. You know, it's a much better margin. It may not be 104%. It may be like 40%. So I think it's a false narrative and a false claim. They're going to be making drugs. If their profit margin declines, it's still a good profit.
Yeah, I would echo that comment and also state, I'm not sure who said it, but said that they were using these profits so that they could develop the next drug that could treat 1 million patients. Well, I would disagree. I would say that there's no better time for a pharmaceutical manufacturer to be in the orphan drug business than right now. And that's where we're seeing it. And because if they treated 1 million patients, then we would have levers of how it's managed and clinically appropriate levers. But now we're in situations of chronic degenerative diseases, whether it's neurologic degenerative diseases, whether it's cystic fibrosis, where the calculus or the evaluation is slower decrement as opposed to improvement. And, I hear the comment, and I don't want this to come across as cynical at all, but I hear the comment of us wanting to find a cure for this, but I sure as hope that cure isn't sold to Vertex.
And we need to figure this out before there is a cure for Alzheimer's. Really, it has to get figured out before then.
All right, well, on that cheery prospect, it does. What I'd like to do is to invite each member of the Policy Roundtable to have a final statement. If you can at all possible, keep it to one sentence. I'll allow one semicolon. That usually gets a nice, rich thought. And what we often benefit from, again, is your thoughts on either the key takeaway that you don't want to get lost in the kind of haystack here, and or a specific request that you think someone could do, some stakeholder in the system could do, that would mean the most to improving both the quality and the value of care that we provide. So you could ask that of somebody else, you could ask it of your own industry, but either do that and or just a kind of a summary statement of what you think a most important key takeaway is for us. So
one sentence.
With a semicolon, I'll give you. Be careful, you talked out of turn. I might let you go first. You don't want to go first. I'm going to start down with David and run this way.
I believe Mano speaks for us both when he says.
Does that mean he gets two sentences? I don't know.
Thanks, David.
This is your time. If you could change the world with your request to improve the care for patients now and in the future, and to kind of shoot for that overall goal of sustainable access to high-value, innovative care, what could you ask for? What would you want this meeting to conclude with an exclamation point?
Well, I'd like the support of the CF Foundation to continue as it's been, which has been great, and I'd like in supporting care centers around the country and in supporting research, including developing new drugs. I'd like Vertex to have to look hard at themselves and add to their wonderful vision of wanting to cure CF and get great drugs for CF. I want them to add a little compassion in there and think about whether they need to have sky-high profits and sky-high salaries for their executives to accomplish this.
Okay, thank you very much. Manu.
Ditto. I think that going through this process, this is an evaluation of cost effectiveness. I think what is pretty convincing from all of this is that these drugs are effective, they're revolutionary, they're changing the natural history of the disease. And so whatever comes out of this, I think that has to be a big part of the message, that these drugs are effective, okay? Let's not lose that in the message of cost effectiveness.
Thank you. Mary, I'm sorry, one, yes.
I can't do a sentence.
I know.
I'm Southern, I can't talk shortly. These are transformative therapies, and I think it is critically important that they be given the time to truly assess what they can do. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. On the flip side, we absolutely must consider our community's ability to access and afford them, and the system as a whole. So those things all have to wind together, and I think we can do that best from a policymaker perspective, if that's the instruction, if you keep the person at the heart of the decision, and you always drive with what is best in this case for somebody with cystic fibrosis.
For someone who doesn't do sentences well, that will do.
It's a long one.
That was good. Thanks. Jeremy.
Trying to summarize this in a way that's helpful, but the patient population in any disease like this, but in particularly in cystic fibrosis, the one I know the best, We have long felt absolutely powerless to do anything to control this monster in our lives. And the work that Vertex Pharmaceuticals, because they're not here, it's easy to mischaracterize them maybe, has absolutely changed our life and given our family hope. And I don't know what dollar amount you put on hope, but it's big. It's a large number, and it's not calculated in the spreadsheets that you're working off of today. If I can ask one, if we're going to do pie in the sky, ask people for things that we're probably not going to get, let's look at every place that we're taking too much profit in the healthcare system on the backs of sick people, and look in a lot of places, because although Vertex is on the table today, there are many other places that we can be looking that contribute to this problem and the dehumanization of kids like mine.
Thank you very much. Jane?
I think that one takeaway or my one wish would be that people could understand that the work of ICER is not, should not be perceived as a threat to access. I think it's a really important part of a long road to assuring access through affordability. And it's a bumpy road, but we have to get there, and ICER, I think, is part of the solution and not a part of disenfranchising people.
Okay, thank you. Eric?
Well, first off, I know my last comment might have piled on Vertex. I guess I'll preface that by saying, if CF Foundation finds a cure for CF, keep it and give it to everybody. But I think what I'll say is that as a payer, we're not interested in putting these kids and these patients in the middle of a tug of war. But we are interested in providing a sustainable healthcare system. And we can prevent diabetes, we can prevent pregnancy complications if patients can have access to insurance and access to care. And when situations such as this condition or condition B or the next meeting that you guys are having that condition puts that in jeopardy, then this, as Shane says, the system's broken, and I hope we can find a way to keep people in the system and make it work better for everybody.
All right, thank you. We're going to conclude with going around the CEPAC for some final statements, and then I'll have a concluding statement as well. But I hope you'll please join me in thanking our Policy Roundtable for their incredible contributions today. I hope you, if you need to go around to the airport, go. If you don't, I hope you can stay. I know some of you had to go to the airport, so no, you can stay right here. Please do. So I'm going to go around the CEPAC then, and again, in a sentence, your kind of final takeaway, something you'd like to emphasize, a reflection, and we'll try to keep it, again, to one sentence-ish, if you can. Reem?
I'm going to go with Mary's sentence.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say, as a clinician who takes care of patients with rare conditions, a lot of those patients look at the CF Foundation and the CF patients as role models for what they can do and how they hope to achieve cure. And as a mother, I do feel with every patient and family member who spoke today, and we do very much appreciate you giving input and actually sharing your experience with us. I think where I have hope is I'm looking at the big picture, and I see we're all working toward the same goal. We all want this cure for those patients, and we want it to be affordable for everyone. So thanks for allowing us to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Stacy?
I think my comment is probably directed towards manufacturers mostly, but thinking about how we can better reward innovation, but still be fair to everyone, all of the patients with need, and also taxpayers and companies. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Scott?
Thanks to the panelists, thanks to the family members and advocacy groups today. It's been an enriching experience across the board. I think my reflection after having gone through, a half dozen of these meetings is in our votes, where we're all on one side on benefit, clearly. Then there's this big valley, nothing in the middle, and then from the value for money on the far end. So it really sticks out to me today that we have this wide valley, and it's in those cases very hard to come to that middle ground sometimes.
Thanks. Don?
It was a pleasure to be here, and especially to see my very old dear friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Boyle, who is fabulous. So I just have a recommendation to think about that I've talked to Manu and Mike about, which has to do with what I think is a bit primitive in terms of how you measure improvement in treatment. And it seems to me as though the biometric capabilities of measuring functional and physical status can be improved, especially with respect to skeletal muscle and in the context of exercise tolerance. I think those are things that muscle strength, muscle mass, myocyte function, instead of saying we gained weight and we have an expiratory volume that's better. And I think if those start getting better, it seems like you ought to join the crowd with thinking about how to take clinical and financial risk for total cost of care, perhaps in conjunction with Vertex, to think about how you're going to be more directly involved with this cost of care issue. I understand it's a price issue, but it seems like this would be ripe for some sort of alternative payment model.
Great, thank you. Tim?
So thank you. I also want to thank the patients and the families that came. I really learned a lot from them, and that really enriched and helped us make decisions. So thank you for all those efforts in the staff and everything. I think the piece I want to add to this is I haven't heard the word said explicitly, market power. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to think about market power here as an economist. And there's market power going on as the elephant in the room, I think. And so there's market power on the manufacturer's side that needs to be dealt with as a society, and it shouldn't be done just on this one drug. And there's market power that some of the payers have that I think they could use a little bit stronger than they do. So, I think we need to think about this and not just put it on this drug, but put it on all of them.
Great, thanks. Rachel?
Thank you all for being willing to engage with us today. I know I find these policy roundtables especially unique. There's very few places where these discussions are being had. My reflection over the past few meetings is I'm struck by the success that rare disease groups and the CF Foundation in particular have had in supporting true advances in care over the years. And it's my hope that rare disease groups will find ways not only to support innovation by marshaling patient resources, but also finding ways to address these pricing and access issues on the back end in the future as these deals are struck.
Thank you very much. Albert?
So I just want to thank the patients who spoke, the patient representatives, the organizations. It's invaluable to hear directly from people affected by a condition, while also looking at evaluations of a new therapy. I work in health economics and cost effectiveness analysis, and I have to say I've never seen benefits of a therapy that are this large. I've also never seen costs this high. And therein lies the tension. Buried within there is also the tension between innovation and the affordability of that innovation. I think at least a part of the solution to this problem is certainly transparency and talking about cost, value, health effects, what happens to people. It's at least a start of the conversation to, I think, solving a larger national, actually global problem.
All right, thanks very much. Ralph?
So I'm a registry nerd, and I agree with all the comments made today, but I want to take this in a different direction. So Mary, I'm really excited about the registry that you have, and I think the society, the foundation has built an infrastructure that is just beginning to be tapped, and it can be increasingly utilized with the even enhanced patient-reported outcomes, for example, and other metrics that you have some of. And one of the exciting things about looking at observational data, which you're doing temporarily over time with these new drugs, is key. But we can help leverage the cost of developing new drugs in terms of a return of investment utilizing embedded clinical trials within your registry by industry that the FDA has shown has had a return of investment of 5 times the cost. In other words, you could do it at 1/5 the cost with an accelerated time frame to getting things to market. So I would take those type of ideas, which I've looked at some of the things that you're utilizing the registry to date, further enhancing that with Vertex or any other people down the line to see if you can help accelerate development in this field at a cheaper cost and a faster rate.
Great, thank you very much. Stuart.
As a new member of the group, I very much appreciate the 4-part process of being able to listen ahead of this meeting to the clinical experts and being able to analyze in some depth the report and then hearing the profound stories from our patient representatives, which was invaluable to me. And lastly, this policy discussion. I do find it frustrating to be at this moment where we have examples of the pharmaceutical corporate world taking advantage of niches, and I hope that this kind of discussion is the nudge that's needed, and so I applaud that potential.
Great, thanks. Jill.
I think my takeaway today is just what it has been really for this past couple of years, I guess. I'm grateful to ICER for taking on the pricing discussion, because it feels like it's the only one that's happening in a public way and in the right way, and just being a voice for sustainability, because it's not sustainable the way it's going for self-insured, for Medicaids, for everybody across this country. I just wish that ICER's influence could affect change more quickly, but I do think that it is speeding it up relative to before ICER existed, so thanks.
Great, thanks.
So a little more gratitude. I'm grateful for the presence of everybody here today. I think that makes necessary and difficult dialogue possible. I mean, for everyone to be fully present like they were today, I'm incredibly grateful. My closing remark, though, is I think we should be very concerned about what the market will still yet bear. That's my takeaway from today. Still a lot of upward. I think the market can bear a lot more.
Thanks. All right. Well, you've actually left me too much time, so I'm going to inflict more than a sentence on you probably. But I do want to start also by celebrating a couple things, not my scratchy voice. One is my memory of being a medical student when I first saw patients with cystic fibrosis. And talk about that valley. I saw them in medical training and then really not again for a long time. But I can feel how the huge quantum shift in the life of those patients and their families. And when you see patients in the hospitals, you only get a tiny feel for what the family's really going through. But cystic fibrosis, kids were in the hospital for a long time, and the teenagers were the ones I got to know the best. And their lives and their families were just completely enmeshed in this long-range, agonizing struggle. And it was really awful. So the idea that there were specific treatments that people could take, a pill that would make their lives better, I remember that sense of celebration, that could be possible for these kids and their families. I also want to celebrate the good faith of the people who are in the audience today who came to participate in the meeting and shared with us and shared up here their experiences and their perspectives. I think that's what good faith looks like. You come and it's a sharing. It's not always easy or light, because that wouldn't be real sharing, but it expresses the deepest needs we all have to be heard and to be part of decision-making that involves us as individuals. So I just want to thank the entire infrastructure, you in the audience, the CEPAC for being here, the ICER team and our colleagues for putting together the report. I was thinking also, in my medical school days, I knew a surgeon who had become very famous. He developed a new, kind of cardiac procedure, and he was revered, and I revered him. And over time, he started revering himself. And he got a little bit cavalier with the patients that he would take and push things and treat patients as his next great leap of progress. It was a classic case of hubris in many ways. And I've seen hubris, in nonprofit hospitals that think they know the best thing to do for their community. It's usually to shoot over the poorer parts and go to the rich suburbs to bring patients in, and they know how best to care for people. I've seen hubris in insurers who think that they know better than the practicing clinician and have systems set up that are really, really wrong in terms of trying to create a clinically sensitive, evidence-based approach to insurance coverage. So there's hubris that can percolate through a lot of settings in the healthcare system. Now, for what ICER is, as a self-proclaimed independent arbiter of value, I would say that hubris is an occupational hazard, right? I mean, we have to be very aware of our role and who we are and what we're trying to do, and to not exercise what we're trying to do through hubris. But hubris is obviously also a risk for innovators, and especially innovator companies. And the one thing that I'm absolutely sure of is that the vast majority of people inside innovator companies are there for the right reason, trying to do the right thing, and they're wonderful, smart, great people. But innovator companies can sometimes fall under hubris, as anybody can. They can do amazing things. They can marshal new science and bring new products to the bedside in ways that no one else could do. No one else could do it. But if you remember the original story, or one of the original stories of hubris, Oedipus, he became famous because he could solve the riddle of the Sphinx, and he basically cured the city of this plague of the Sphinx, and people were getting eaten up all the time. And he got quite convinced that he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we all know what happened from there. So even the greatest companies that are bringing really important treatments and even potential cures, they can suffer hubris. And what does hubris look like? In that setting, it just becomes a little bit too much of a sense of glory in past accomplishments. It's associated with, yes, bright, shiny new buildings and high CEO salaries and things that are meant to serve other purposes. There's a hubris that goes along with being a hotshot on Wall Street. And I think that the balance for hubris in innovator companies has to be a deep sense of social responsibility, and many of them have it. And that's manifested by listening to the patients and their families, both on their clinical needs, but also on their broader kind of societal needs. It involves a clear understanding that what they're working on as a company is not the only need in the healthcare system, that other people need research, that other people need resources, and that, yes, even health isn't the only thing that we have to spend money on. So ultimately, if we want a health system in which we can care for patients with the hope and the mercy that we want to bring them, it has to be supported by a sense of social justice exercised by everybody, including the innovator companies that are part of that equation. So for us, all of us, I think our job is to help hold that mirror up to each of us and to innovator companies, to engage with them in these kinds of conversations, to ground it in the patient experience, to talk honestly about evidence, to take tough decisions. But I think that's ultimately a responsibility for us. But at the end of the day, these companies are heroes, and we want them to be heroes. We want to reward them the next, laurel wreath for the next fantastic treatment. But they are not unlimited. They're not omnipotent, and we have to figure out how to create, as Eric said, what the market will bear. We are the market. Ultimately, we as a society are the market, and we have to help create the structure and the expectations so that we can create great innovations in a way that will be fairly available and to everybody. So that's my longer than a one-sentence conclusion. Celebration is at the front end, and celebration is at the back. Celebration again for the CEPAC service, for our fantastic policy roundtable, for the outstanding science from our collaborators and from the ICER team, from the organizers and the logistics of today's meeting, and again to you in the audience. Thank you very much for coming and participating, and we'll see you at the next meeting.